So, continuing our discussion of typography here, things to take into consideration as you start working with type in packaging design is to understand the kind of customers you're working with here. They kind of break into three categories: those who will scrutinize every tiny piece of information on the packaging before even considering to buy it, or those who simply look at a package design, are inspired enough to buy it. I definitely fall into this category. I will buy products just because I like the type on the packaging. Oftentimes I come to regret that, but definitely I fall into that second category. And then there are those who they just don't really care about the design or the ingredients. They're more concerned about what's inside, the quality, the design, usability, or durability of the product itself. Remember, too, when you're designing your type, you're communicating with the audience here, your consumers. So your task is to communicate the message of the brand on here. It's an exchange of ideas and also to get across the branding or the personality of the company and the product itself. So I put a lot of examples in here of different styles of type. You can definitely tell by the typography kind of who they view as their ideal customer or their prime customer on here. Choosing the right font for the right job is very important. So there's a lot of considerations with the type of fonts you choose or typefaces you use. There you can see very lightweight. That might be a great font to use if you're selling lean cuisine, where the idea is you can lose weight with this product. So maybe if I use light fonts, it will reinforce that idea of it's healthy and you'll lose weight on it. Bold, if you want to make a very bold statement, use very bold type. Serif fonts we talked about, and italic versions of serif fonts. Condensed fonts are fonts that are very, very narrow. So maybe if you're designing something where the package is going to be very vertical, say like a wine bottle label or something, you might want to consider condensed fonts. Extended fonts are ones that are much more horizontal, so maybe that would work better on, say, like a box for toothpaste or something. Script fonts we talked about, and also the display fonts, which are usually the much more decorative fonts, which can be great for a brand name or a product name, but the real decorative fonts don't really work well when you're getting into more of the nitty-gritty of the description of the product on here. Figuring out what style to use. Some things that there's a lot of visual cues that we put off in graphic design through our image choices and our font choices. Sans serif fonts tend to convey being more modern and a little bit more youthful. Now, that doesn't mean you have to use them if that's your product, but that's kind of one of the visual cues that the sans serif font gives off. Serif fonts, on the other hand, tend to be more classic, more old school. They tend to be, can look a little bit more vintage or retro. Italic fonts tend to convey, those are fonts that are slanted a little bit. They tend to convey more urgency. So a lot of, medical things that you may see, Band-Aids, or even if you go to the emergency room or an ambulance, they'll use these italic fonts to convey urgency. We mentioned with with script fonts, they fall into these two casuals, very formal, very casual. And then the last two are kind of from my history working in the movie business. Big chunky fonts, say that 3 times fast, tend to convey comedy. So whenever we were designing titles for comedic movies, this was one of our go-to fonts. It's called Gill Sans Bold. The flip side of that, for serious films, we would always go with these more classic serif fonts. This is one called Trajan, which is really based on the ancient Roman fonts that were used to be carved into architecture or monuments or what have you. So if I was working on a film and the filmmakers thought it was a very serious film and it might win an Oscar or something, this would be kind of one of our go-to fonts for that. So keep in mind with your font choices, you're going to be really emphasizing the brand or product name. I put this example in here too because you can mix and match fonts. We'll talk more about that a little bit. So here for Smart Food, you can see a combination of a sans serif font with a more casual script. to kind of really emphasize the two words in there. For the small type, generally all the legal or technical information that you may have on the back of a package, it's usually best to stick with simpler sans serif or serif fonts. Though, as you can see in this example, to really emphasize the brand, which is much more kind of casual, maybe a little bit more humorous, you can see for all the technical information, they still stuck with this very casual hand-done font in there. Things to take into consideration is not just your product type, but if you know the type of packaging you're going to be using. So in this case, for this razor, you can see the decision was made to use this translucent plastic box for it. So that's obviously going to take into consideration, or you need to take that into consideration in choosing your typography for it. Or in this little blister pack here. So lip balm. So this, it's going to be a cardboard backing with a blister pack plastic on top. So again, you can take that into consideration when you choose the fonts you're going to use for it. You always have to take into consideration your customer, and this is where marketing and demographics come in. What is the age of your ideal customer? Is it something geared for children or young adults? Is it something geared for seniors? Is it something geared more for families or young adults? The gender, that can come into consideration too. I'll show you an example of that as well. Language, are you appealing to a particular community, or maybe it's a product that's based in a community, but you want it to transcend and be able to communicate across all communities, which ties into culture, especially here in Southern California. There's a lot of different cultural communities around here, and there's a very kind of melting pot atmosphere or ethos that comes into it. So you may want to take that into consideration. And then personal preference, if you have marketing information on what your customers have liked in the past, you may want to take that into consideration as well. One other thing you may take into consideration, and this you see occasionally in the grocery store with product designs, you'll notice that the information is in both English and French. And you might be thinking, why would something being sold here in California be in French? We don't have a huge French community here. Well, the reason for that is a lot of products sold in America are also sold in Canada. And Canada is legally, technically a bilingual country. So anything that is going to be sold in Canada also has to have all the information in French as well. And to save money, oftentimes they'll just use the same packaging here in the States as well. I mentioned gender, that comes into play. It's been a little bit of a controversy. When you think of something like deodorant, when it comes right down to it, the ingredients in either of these deodorants is almost identical. Usually the only thing that's different is the fragrance that's added to it. Where it's been controversial is these products are essentially identical, and yet oftentimes what you will find is products that are geared towards women actually end up costing more. So that's been something that has really been kind of more in the news lately, something they're trying to address. But you can see just in the choice of colors and fonts how they can appeal to either a male or female market in here. Type technicalities, things to take into consideration. This is kind of a general design rule. You should probably limit yourself to one or two fonts, maybe three. Once you start using more than three fonts, it really starts looking like kind of amateur hour in the design. The one exception to that, and we'll talk about different styles, is something that's maybe a modern take on what we call Victorian style. Victorian style from the 1800s was really kind of known for this just mishmash of lots and lots of different fonts. That's still a style, and we'll talk about that, modern versions of it. So then maybe you could use 3 or 4 or 5 fonts, but generally when you're doing your initial design layouts, really try and stick to 2, 3 fonts max on there. Also take into consideration the personality. All the fonts that you're going to be working with, some of them have more overt personality to them, but all fonts have some personality. and you want to make sure you match the personality of the fonts you choose to the personality of your brand or product in here. So here's a good example of that. It's simple sans serif type, but you can see they've done it dimensional. They've juggled it a little bit. They swapped out popcorn kernels for the O's. So even though it's a fairly simple sans serif font, it's got a little bit more playful quality to it. Here you can see more versions of that as well. How you choose how to align your type, how it works in the format of your packaging. Do you center it? Do you do it off to the left or to the right? These are things that you'll want to play around with when you do your initial thumbnail design in here. Talking about some trends in packaging design and typography these days, I'll show you just a few and we'll talk more when we talk about current trends here. One of them is creating a background or a texture out of the type, almost like creating wallpaper out of it. So here you can see some examples of that in different style fonts. Another trend that's been very big for the last few years is, and this is kind of an example of kind of a modern version of Victorian design, but the trend is doing this kind of framing technique. So creating decorative frames that kind of really help highlight the product information in here. So here's some more examples of using various framing devices. Might be other typography, might be decorative elements or illustrated elements in here. Here's an example, and we'll talk about this too. Another trend is what we call billboarding, where the type and design is laid out in such a way that when you position these on a shelf, the product name or the graphics kind of cross over from one product to another. So here you can see the decorative frame around the word ivory appears to cross over from one package to another, and that will pop up in a couple other lectures as well. Minimalist type, which is very simple, clean, and just like the word implies, very minimal type, tends to kind of convey being a little bit more upscale. That's where you tend to see it a lot more often. So here you can see some examples of more of that minimalist type design. All right, here in T. And again, different ways of treating it. Different, you can do it with serif or sans serif. Here you can see even on one package, I've got sans serif, I've got lowercase serif type, I've even got italic serif type in there. Vintage or retro looking packaging is all the rage. One theory is that these days, with everything that's going on and with our lives being ruled by all our digital devices, kind of hearkening back to a time when things were at least appeared to be simpler with more of this vintage or retro type. So you can see a lot of that. That's been very big for the last 5 or 10 years in there. Now, when we talk about vintage or retro, you can choose any different era. Here's some stuff that kind of harkens back to kind of the Art Deco period of the 20s and 30s. Some of the earlier designs were more Victorian in style, like this one. And then this is also vintage retro, but it's more in what we refer to as a mid-century modern style. So design that looks like it might be out of the 1950s or 60s. And then I'll end with this. This is a trend. It's been going around for about 10 years now. For lack of a better word, we call this hipster type. And it really falls into that vintage retro category. It really started, I think, with all the craft beers that really kind of took off in the late 2000s to early 2010s here. And here's the deal with the hipster trend. I keep thinking it's got to be played out. This has been going around for about 10 years. And yet, for whatever reason, it just shows no sign of stopping. So I will just use this as a cautionary tale. There's nothing wrong with doing hipster design, but you're really getting in on the tail end of a trend. And especially for putting something in your portfolio, you maybe don't want to look like you're, buying too much into a trend that's on its way out. That being said, for all I know, this trend may still be around in another 10 years. You never know. People tend to love it. It is a really good look. It's kind of a cool little modern take on a vintage look. So again, I'll leave you with that, and we'll talk much more about style as we work further throughout the semester.